So my name's Gifford and I'm Somerset Rivers Authority Community Engagement Officer. So we work across the whole county to help people be better prepared for flooding. And I work with Will on the Adapting the Levels project. So he asked me just to do a tiny bit at the end of his. He's talked about the structure, and I was just going to talk a little bit about the process that we've been using in some areas around sort of decision making. I was also going to rely quite heavily on my PowerPoint, so I'll put it up. The people in front might be able to see just on the subject of riparian ownership, you know, we get this comes up an awful lot, and I think it's going to be an increasing issue.
Shouldn't you be saying riparian responsibilities rather than riparian ownership?
Yeah, so riparian responsibilities lie with the landowner. You know, you can break it down in slightly more nuanced ways when you look at sort of boundaries and things like that. But a lot of the time there's a misconception that the responsibility for watercourse maintenance lies with the Environment Agency. In some cases it does if they have assets, but usually it sits with the owner of the land. And there's a lot of people who aren't aware of that. There's also been historically there's been work done by agencies like Highways, and there just isn't the money anymore to do a lot of that work. So it sometimes comes as an unpleasant surprise to people that they actually have responsibilities. But collaborative working structures like the ones that you know, Will's involved in, but also on a smaller scale in terms of, like, you know, if there's a series of houses who have a school around one of their gardens, it can be quite valuable for people to work together. I'm just going to. I won't talk as long as Will did, rarely do, but just around the processes that we've been using with helping to shape decision making with an uncertain future. So first of all, I just want to say something about the context that we sort of, you know, that we're all looking at. So by 2050, the heat wave of 2018, when you might remember it went brown and crispy, that's projected to be a typical summer. Not an extremes, and we'll be having extremes that are worse than that. So that's a huge pressure that all the landowners, farmers and infrastructure is going to be facing. Another really remarkable statistic is that obviously we are working towards transitioning to net zero in this country. The Climate Change Committee have said that that is going to require 21% of our current agricultural land to be used for energy cropping trees. That's a huge shift. The other 79%, because we're effectively taking that out of production, is going to have to increase its productivity by 10% every decade until 2050. 30%, getting 30% more out of the agricultural land that's left. It's a huge change. We know these changes are coming. There's also huge changes coming with subsidy schemes. So the current subsidy scheme that farmers receive is already being phased out at the end of this year, and it's being phased out over the course of several years. And that's going to be replaced by the Environmental Land Management Scheme. So ELMS, as it's known, they're trialling all sorts of different versions of this all around the country. We're looking at in this area, and Will's involved with looking at payment for floodwater storage in the winter. So there's a growing recognition in farming communities that there is going to be a transition for what they get paid for from, you know, in some cases from agricultural production to what we call ecosystem services, which are what the environment normally gives us for free. So reduction of carbon emissions, sequestering carbon, flood mitigation, and especially in this area around the sort of pollutants, the phosphate reduction, because we've seen that has caused huge problems. So the subsidy, the background of the subsidies is a huge issue. This graph, which maybe we can circulate the slides afterwards, but the subsidies represent a huge percentage of farmers' profits in this area. So on the levels and moors, we have largely lowland grazing and mixed farming. 94% of lowland grazing profits come from those direct payments. So you take away the payments, and you know, the system doesn't stand as it is now. When it comes to mixed farms, it's even greater. 114% of their profits are from those subsidies. So hugely vulnerable to change. But there's been a lot of conversations that we've been undertaking as part of this project. FWAG have been doing one-to-one meetings with farmers on the levels and moors. And there's actually, there's a real changing attitude. 73% of those surveyed said that they would consider being paid for floodwater storage in the winter. There's also, the farmers on the levels and moors have a huge value for nature. They've been in countryside stewardship schemes for a long time, a lot of them have. So this concept of being paid to deliver services that help the environment is not new. And there's a real acknowledgement there's this close link between biodiversity and agriculture. So just in terms of the context, the wider context, what we've found, some of you might have come along to some of the public events we did just before COVID hit in Wedmore and Langport, where we were talking about nature-based solutions to flooding and drought, climate change adaptation, and what we've been doing, and we've been doing a series of sort of workshops and with some parish councillors who might be here as well, and we've been assessing where people's opinion lie on this statement. The management of water and flood defence on the Somerset levels relies on infrastructure such as embankments, dredging and pumping. In future, natural process solutions which protect and restore the natural functions of the river catchments, floodplains and coastlines also need to be a major part of the solution. And we've had, our responses from that has been sort of 93.5% agree or strongly agree. So there's a broad consensus around that we need to be looking at the sort of nature-based solutions, natural process solutions more. So we know that there's change coming. Those figures for 2050 with the heat waves, that's more or less fixed because of climate lag. So climate lag is the emissions that we're putting out now, most of you probably know this, there's a lag between when the emissions are released and when they're actually felt in the climate. So the climate lag is 30, 40 years, something like that. So we've got a lot of climate change in the coast, even if we got to net zero today. And for that reason, we've got locked-in changes. The 2050 drought heat figures are more or less locked in, unfortunately. And beyond that, there's lots of uncertainty. It depends on how fast we reduce our emissions. It depends on how the sort of feedback loops play out. So we need a way of planning that marries the long-term vision with the change a range of different possibilities with short-term actions that we can undertake now. And we need to identify which of those short-term actions could lead to lock-in. So we've seen it with the house building programme. There's been a huge amount of houses that have been built that aren't resilient to future heat that we're expecting. So we need to be making decisions now that don't close off our options for the future. And if we can find a sequence of cost-effective, low regrets or no regrets solutions, then that will help us chart a path to the future. So no regrets are, for example, nature-based solutions to flooding are often called no regrets solutions because they also increase your biodiversity, they increase your amenity value, they have multiple benefits, and for that reason you're not going to ever regret putting them in, even if you have to then subsequently put in something further to help reduce flood risk. And we need a planning system that's going to help us look at possible transformational change. We may have multiple paradigm shifts forced by the climate situation as it develops. And the other thing that planning for climate change needs is it needs to account for the fact that we're used to planning for sort of linear and incremental change. But with climate change, we have these thresholds that we hit. And we saw it in North America this year when we had the heat dome. Suddenly a lot of infrastructure failed because it hit a certain temperature that it couldn't deal with. So you've got railway lines, they'll buckle at a certain temperature. You have a flood defence that will overtop at a certain point. So rather than having incremental change, we have these tipping points, these thresholds at which you need to change what is effective. So one of the ways that one of the best ways that's considered to plan for climate change is called adaptation pathways. It's a process that's been used, for example, by the London Thames 2100 team, who have got a plan for London for up to 4 metres of sea level rise, and that's the adaptation pathways approach, where you chart a sort of path. You've got all of your different options, and you find a way that the options you're choosing today aren't locking off your options for the future. We've developed an online tool where some of these adaptation pathways that we've worked on with members of the public, we put them together and you can look at that on our website and find adaptation pathways on agriculture on the Somerset levels. We've looked at things like surface water flooding in a specific community, which is quite good because it's something that the parish councils that we work with have got a lot of agency over, and so there's actually actionable things in there. So some of the things that we found this process really helps with, it identifies knowledge gaps, and it identifies interdependencies and enabling actions. So with the knowledge gaps, it's a huge thing what we find every time we work with a group. It's like what we don't know is huge. So identifying what it is we need to find out is usually the first step. The interdependencies, there's lots of other drivers of change, so we might want to reduce water levels as much as possible to reduce flooding, but we might be increasing inadvertently our drought risk. It may be that there is an option way down the line that we hope we don't need, but we might, but if that's going to be viable, there's things that need to happen before that. So it's a way of structuring thinking around this very uncertain future. We're going to try and translate this to working with some of the sort of more associations with specific challenges within the agricultural communities in terms of the horizons. You know, there's so much uncertainty around subsidies, markets, that it's, you know, we're going to sort of adapt this way of thinking to try and suit that sort of constituency. But we'd be more than happy to talk to any of the parish councils, any of you represented here in more detail if it's something you'd be more interested in. So that's more or less what I had to say. I hope that makes sense. Happy to answer any questions at this time.
How have we got? 2:30 now. Now we're going to.
Okay. That's probably.
Yeah. Thank you, you two.